Well, I'm pleased to be punctual.
That's excellent. Here we are. Here's Gareth. Hi, Gareth. But I can't hear you, Gareth.
Okay, I'm going to try and use the camera microphone instead.
Yep, I can hear you now.
Yeah, I have a nightmare with Teams. I've got 5 different sort of accounts, and I was about to come in as the government of Jersey, which would have been a bit confusing for everybody.
We'll accept anybody. Yeah. Okay, so I'll make it 12:01. I'm still waiting for Naomi. She had difficulties getting on last week. Laura, I believe, is on holiday, as is Kevin. So we're going to be a little bit light. Hopefully, you can all see my screen. We might as well kick off. And if anybody wants to join in the conversation or make a comment, please electronically raise your hand. We have Nick with us as well. He is marshalling, so Nick will notice that your hand is up, and then signal to me and open, and then you can open your line. So it's all straightforward. It's just team stuff that you're all kind of used to. It's just a few more people on these calls, so I shall kick off as normal. Let me just introduce my panel. I have Gareth from Ferret Systems. Hi, Gareth.
Morning.
I have and I have Liz with me.
Hello.
Hi, Liz. And when she comes on, Naomi will join us this week. As I say, Kevin, who normally does the business update, isn't with us this week. He's on holiday, as is Laura. So on that basis, I'm going to kick off and go through the slides. On that part, a reminder here that we are changing the BEX product range. There's an upgrade is starting to come out in the summer of 2021, so not long to go now. And we're going to be running a series of 20 to 30-minute presentations on what enhancements we're implementing. So if anybody wants to come along to those, if they can email Nick for dates and times, or you can register for the sessions at that link there. I shall email these slides out after this session, so you'll get that link. Anyway, that's that bit done. So as normal, we'll just have a quick look at the stats. There's no real great changes. For those of you who have not been on these sessions before, these are the BEX stats. These are the new claim stats, so that we can see who is making applications. This is not caseload, it's just applications, and this is CTR at the calculation stage, and we can see that it's starting really to just settle down now. And in fact, actually, if we have a quick look at these stats here, the claims submitted to the systems, we can see are pretty much back to 2019 levels now, as things have been progressing. So that's that done. Normally I'd go to business rates now and over to Kevin, who will say, I'll only be quick. Normally he is quick, but he isn't here this week, so I won't try and kid you that I know what I'm talking about. But I do want to have a look at a couple of reports and discuss those with the panel this week. And the first one was the IPPR's report on poverty, which came out. Did you see this report, Gareth, at all?
No, I haven't yet. I've been swamped in the last week with having to do paying work, I'm afraid.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. So it's only geeky people like myself that tends to look at these. But this was a sort of interesting report, or maybe not necessarily that interesting, because I think probably most people on the line would have come to these conclusions. But because it's based on evidence, it's quite useful. They make some observations. I mean, first off, they make the observation that the welfare system is built on the notion that work is the main route out of poverty. And this government has promised to level up opportunities for that through skills, jobs and economic growth. They then go on to say that there's an increasing number of working families around the country, and the promise of social mobility through hard work as a route out of poverty alone is failing to deliver. I mean, Gareth, I expect you probably see this in the work that you do.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly true, and there are a lot of reasons behind it. The one that I spend quite a lot of time looking at, of course, is the marginal deduction rate stuff, how little you actually get out of work. When you look at the deductions that are made for tax and national insurance, and then the universal credit taper, or the tax credit taper followed by HB, followed by CTR, depending of course upon what local authority you're in, and you'd get an enormous difference in the deduction rates depending upon the hours you work and the amount you earn, of course. But it's still very, very typical for you to get to keep, maybe £1 out of every £10 that you earn.
Yeah, Liz.
Yeah, I can't argue with that. I think it's ever been thus. It just so happens that the complications of the system at the moment make it seem even worse than it used to in before, when we spend a lot of time, particularly customer services, talking to people about whether or not they would be better off in work. And this is when the system was quite simple. And many people felt that they wouldn't be. Especially if you add on top of that, the extra cost of working, clothes,
but there's certainly
fares.
Plenty of examples, isn't there, Liz, that working is much more of a natural state. I mean, I know there's often that view that people shy away from work, but actually, even if work pays low, people prefer to work.
I agree with you there. It is better probably to be in work. I mean, what we always used to say was, well, although this is probably damned by this report, because you used to say, well, at least, things can get better for you if you're working. Whereas, if you stick around on benefits, to put it bluntly, you're only going to get what you're going to get. There's no further you can go. But this is sort of slightly dampened by this report, that hard work is no longer a route out of poverty.
I don't think
I suppose, is the question.
I don't think it has been. I mean, I think hard work has been little rewarded at the bottom end. It's not until you start certainly lifting yourself over the benefits level that you actually start seeing the returns. It's one of the things that I've criticised quite a lot in the past. Things like the government, which will say that increases in tax allowances are great for the lower paid, or the national.
Which they're not.
It's a really good way of helping the lower paid. And as you say, they're not. Increases in personal allowances go, to the people that can make use of them. If you're on benefits, all that happens, of course, is that your net earnings go up. That's taken into account for the benefit, and your benefit goes down, so you don't gain anything near as much. And most of the national living wage increase goes straight back to the government in terms of tax, NI, and benefit savings. I mean, about 90% of it does.
Yeah, so I mean, so this kind of then brings out the point that they're making here, which is that working poverty, which is experienced by households where one or more people are in work, has been rising under successive governments since 2004.
Yep. No argument.
No. I realised as I said it, that wasn't going to generate a discussion. I thought also the interesting point here was also that they kind of suggested that past successes do show that government policy can limit or even indeed reverse increases in poverty. I mean, do we really particularly see that? I mean, the argument is, child poverty was reduced between the late 90s and 2010.
I mean, and there's a legal responsibility to reduce child poverty. The problem, of course, comes with people's interpretation of what poverty means, whether it's absolute poverty or whether it's proportional. And of course, we're talking about the under 60% kind of definition of average earnings poverty, of average income poverty here. So that you can actually make more people poor by making some people prosperous.
Yeah, and I guess probably the thing that I think is a little bit alarming, and I guess probably this was something that we've seen, haven't we, Liz, is that the rates of working poverty were up at 17% in working households. That was more than 1 in 6. And that was before the pandemic took hold in 2020.
Yes. This is quite a difficult report, isn't it? Because effectively, there's not much to argue with here.
No, and I think this makes for quite uncomfortable reading, because it kind of does point really towards the fact that some of the stuff that we may believe or take for granted is generally wrong. And why I think that's important for local authorities is because, of course, we have control over CTR, and so therefore, CTR is one of the few tools that a local authority has to try and adjust this kind of thing locally, really. And I think that's a difficult ask for local authorities.
I mean, that's true in England, isn't it? Not true, of course, in Scotland, Wales, or with rate rebates in Northern Ireland. And one of the things that I see with a certain amount of kind of schadenfreude to an extent, of course, is that in Wales we have effectively a national CTR scheme, and that's been maintained at pretty much the old CTB kind of levels. But we've looked at England, and I have to look at the English local authorities because we have to incorporate their CTR calculations in our benefit calculators. And I looked in horror at the kind of cuts that they're imposing and the bizarre kind of effects that come out of really local authorities not understanding the way that the overall benefit system works and the way that universal credit works. And how it's taken into account. And sometimes I think they're unintentional effects. Sometimes you look at it and you think, okay, that seems to be a scheme that only pays off for one-legged, red-headed people of the age of 72, and the leader's aunt happens to have red hair, one leg, and is the age of 72. I can't understand the reasoning behind some of the things that have been introduced, although most of them are there just to save money.
Yeah, and I do think this is probably very difficult for revenues and benefit managers who may be caught between making a proposal and having a proposal foisted upon them. And for governments, they've got whole teams. I mean, they've got the Office of Budgetary Responsibility to help them work through this kind of thing, and all those numerous advisors and departments to assist them. And I think it's quite a big ask for local authorities, who really quite often are having to look at things like their administration and how the cost of administration to their budgets.
I'm not sure that's fair, Malcolm. I mean, yes, it's a big ask, but it's an enormous responsibility as well. And you can't just say, well, it's too difficult, so we won't bother trying. I mean, we have a big future benefits modelling system that could do that. It incorporates all the kind of the local authority schemes, so you can run those kind of models, and it's used a lot by people, housing associations, doing that kind of to check on the effects of rent levels on the kind of the tenant cohorts and so forth. So you can do it. It's not expensive stuff to do. I think there's more time pressures in some cases than financial pressures that hit people.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that, and I wasn't implying that we should just ignore it because it's too difficult to do. I mean, quite the opposite. But I mean, I just think that the pause on the time for a revenues and benefits manager is such that it does make it does make it difficult, because they'll have 101 other things also to have to manage, like track and trace and many other things. I mean, Liz, you've often been in this position.
I think it's one of those things. I think CTRS has sort of caught up with local authorities and revenues and benefits managers, if you like. It has started to form for various reasons, it has started to form a bigger part of their job. And actually, I think it requires more thought now than it had in the past. Let's face it, most local authorities, when it first came in, adapted the CTB scheme and just made people pay a percentage rather than a full 100%. And so it went on. Now you get the slightly more, I don't even want to say innovative, but different schemes, income bands. But how robust are income bands? I look at some of them and think to myself, well, okay, so what have you done? You've just thrown a bit of income at the wall and hope it'll stick. It doesn't have any bearing in reality, or any bearing on exactly what the economic and model is of their particular area. Otherwise,
Absolutely.
they would be the same.
I mean, it's ruined my definition of means-tested benefits, I have to say, because I used to say means-tested benefits work the same all over the world. You've got to assess how much somebody needs and how much they've got. And if they've got less than they need, then you give them something. Well, that doesn't work with banded schemes. You're just looking at what they've got. You've got no consideration of what they need.
And the different bits that local authorities look at as well as to what people have.
Yeah.
But has this been the challenge for CTR, that in many ways to begin with, because of the short period of time, certainly to begin with, local authorities really had to stick with what they knew, because otherwise the cost would have been far too expensive. And then there is a reluctance, I think, from local authorities to move away from means testing. But CTR is really should be geared up much more around the circumstances of the individual, rather than necessarily purely their income.
Yes.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Let's have a quick look at the causes. Most of these are quite short. This kind of links into the discussion we were having last week about housing. So the conclusion.
Malcolm, you've got a hand up here.
Oh, have I? Nick,
yes.
Who's got their hand up?
Jeff.
Hi, Jeff. Go on. Do you want to pitch in, Jeff?
Yeah. Hi, Malcolm. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I just wanted to say with the income banding thing, we have it in Manchester for universal credit claimants, and it kind of helps to cut down work in that, with fluctuations in universal credit every month, there's less adjustments to the council tax reduction, and therefore less revisions of bills, adjustment notices for council tax going out. I agree with what you're saying. It doesn't take into account outgoings, but from an administration point of view, it seems to have helped us on that front.
That is pretty critical, isn't it, Jeff? I mean, I think most local authorities, particularly directors of finance, are looking for those savings on the administration costs, aren't they?
Yeah. I think I can't remember, some London authority was doing it a couple of years ago, and we had a look at it. I'm not sure how many authorities do it, but it's probably a few more now. But I think it has cut down the fluctuations and the, as I said, the amount of different council tax support notifications we're sending out, and less adjustment notices, and of course that affects direct debits and payment plans for people. So it's been useful on that front, I think.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jeff. All of that stuff is quite important, isn't it, Gareth? I mean, I know you're from the outside looking in, but it does kind of speak to some of those pressures.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not trying to avoid the reality of the pressures that the local authorities are under, both kind of administratively and financially. It's just the balance, and if the balance tilts towards, it's easier to administer. I mean, it'd be easier to administer if you give everybody 100% bill and no support whatsoever. but that would be considered generally unfair. And I think the problem really is that we've now got across England an enormous postcode lottery where people in exactly the same circumstances, getting the same local authority services, are expected to pay substantially, hugely different amounts from time to time. And B, if you don't recognise people's needs in some way, then you can really be imposing huge problems on them by asking for money that they just can't pay, and then that drops you into that vicious circle of all the recovery and the legal actions and so forth, with the costs and the effort involved in that side of it, and still no hope of getting any money from it.
Yeah, I mean, Liz, it also has the effect, doesn't it? I mean, of just shifting the responsibility. I mean, Gareth quite rightly said, if you had a 100% scheme, then that would make administration even easier. But then that just pushes the problems, especially if it's financial problems, from one part of the council to another part of the council, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think that seems to be happening all over the place, really. I mean, I go down to the fact that we all, unless you have some sort of coordinated response. I mean, it really is a coordinated response to debt in many ways, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, actually, we've got, people, Gareth's absolutely right. I mean, there are people who just, it's no good saying, well, you should be able to pay this. They just can't. And they very probably can't pay that because they have debts elsewhere, quite a lot of them to the local authority, particularly in relation to housing. OK, so what do you prioritise in your life as a family? You've got one element of the council telling you that you've got, you're in rent arrears. That's the roof over your head. And then you've got one bit of the council telling you, well, you could go to prison, or we'll take recovery, or we'll charge you more for not paying your council tax. Where do you go? It's an impossible decision for a lot of households.
I'd be quite interested.
And I think we have to have a recognition of that as local authorities.
You're right, Liz. I'd be quite interested if anybody on the line, whether your local authority is taking a more coordinated approach to debt, and how these are playing out in your local authorities. If you raise your hand, then we'll make certain that you can get in and speak on the subject. Nick, are you still there? Are you keeping an eye on hands raising?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, Liz was just quicker on the finger there.
She's a bit speedy there, Liz.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Nick. I'll try and hold back next time.
The other bit of the balance, of course, is how much effort local authorities are putting in terms of income maximisation, in terms of making sure people are getting all the help and all the benefits that they should be. And again, we see cuts in advice funding, not as bad as it used to be, but we don't see any kind of restoration of the advice funding that was around, a decade and more ago.
Yeah. Okay, so it's 12:24 now, so let's just have a quick look at the causes that they came up with. So housing, because we were speaking about housing last week, but this kind of reinforces the conversation that we were having last week. The key factor is that housing costs in the private rented sector have risen substantially faster amongst poor working households when compared to the average. And we didn't really touch. Sorry, Gareth.
And local housing allowances haven't increased.
Yes, absolutely. So housing costs are now 39% higher for poor households than in 1996-97 in real terms, compared to just a 19% increase of the median amongst all households over the same period. And 1 in 4 households are projected to be living in the private rented sector by 2025, and average housing costs being the highest in this sector. I mean, I saw an article yesterday, I think it may have been in the Observer, which was saying that there's still a strong view amongst many people who are living in rented accommodation that they just don't want to buy, that the private rented sector looks like it's going to be still fairly oversubscribed for a good number of years yet.
Isn't that one of the problems, that people who perhaps could afford to buy even now, and certainly could have afforded to buy in the past, are renting, and that pushes rents up. Simple market forces. And the people at the bottom end are chopped out because things like the local housing allowances are not keeping pace, anywhere near keeping pace with the real rise in accommodation. The overall benefits cap. Forget private rented sector. If you're in a social rent anywhere in Wales, and we've got pretty low social rents, and you've got 3 kids, then you're hit by the overall benefits cap if benefits are what you depend on. So I mean, the government is removing buying power, removing purchasing power from people in the rented sector at a huge rate.
And this all then comes back as well to local authorities in the fact that people can't afford to pay their council tax either. Back to what Liz was saying, having to decide which you're going to pay.
It's all right. You've got discretionary housing payments. Oh, forgive me. Are those being maintained at the same level?
But I mean, it also risks, doesn't it, to quite a great degree. I mean, the government talks a lot about levelling up, and most people in the street assume levelling up means, because I think to a certain extent the government briefing on this has made it such, that we are talking about levelling up the north with the south. But nobody talks about the levelling up that's happening within our social policies. I mean, obviously there is going to be a disconnect between those people who are thriving and those people who aren't, simply because of the way our social policies are put together. And I mean by that, obviously, welfare. I hate the term welfare. Our social security policies. I mean, you've got a 2-tier system here, haven't you? You've got the people who are renting, who are still going to be, as Gareth says, at the lower end, struggling probably really hard, or more than they ever have done, to pay their rent and getting into debt. That is a 2-tier recovery.
Yeah.
And nobody seems to care about that.
No, you're right, Liz. The second cause they found was wages. They said wages are failing to provide enough protection against poverty. If we had time to look at the other report that kind of reinforces much of this, particularly at this point in time, but we'll look at that one next week. But fundamentally, 2 full-time earners paid at the minimum wage are needed for families to avoid being pulled into poverty. And even this is not enough for an increasing number of households. And then, of course, social security. I mean, fundamentally, the third factor, housing support in particular, is failing to keep up with the impact of runaway rents, which is what you just said, Gareth. So, it is unfortunately all there. And then finally, childcare costs, which we sometimes talk about, but largely tend to then forget about. But a fourth factor is that given the increasing necessity of having 2 parents in regular work to avoid poverty, childcare costs are just rising and are unaffordable. So, this is a growing and neglected cause, they say, of modern working poverty, and I think that's probably true. Gareth, I mean, you probably look at childcare costs more than many in that excellent work that you do or benefits in the future.
I mean, yeah, childcare is a really worrying area. Firstly, I mean, there are some areas, like, I keep coming back to Wales, where we have a couple of years of free childcare provided, the cost of the government. But most people who depend on in-work benefits depend on the childcare help they get from that, and that pays up to 70%, which sounds like a good contribution. But of course, it's capped, and it's capped at the same rate for 2 children as if we've got 3 or 4 children needing childcare. And because of that, if you actually try and model what people get from working, you can see a kind of reasonable gain from people working, 5 hours, 10 hours, 15 hours a week at kind of national living wage levels. But then they hit the maximum amount of childcare support that's payable, and that MDR thing kicks in again, and you're back to being expected to work, conditionality of the universal credit, for no real return, or actually for a loss in some cases.
Yeah, and we came kind of late as a country, didn't we, to the idea of introducing a two-child policy. We came to it just at the time China was saying, no, have more children, because we have a lack of young people. That often seems strange to me as well. This just didn't seem to me to be an area of government policy that had been properly considered at all.
I don't know whether it's social engineering or whether it's just financial saving.
Yeah. Nick?
Yeah, Rose was making a point, thinking that many used to get help from grandparents, but can see more and more having to work longer, so they can't help in the same way.
No, I mean,
it's also that you can't get help for kinship care. You can't have your grandparents looking after the kids and pay them a few pounds for the cost of doing it. Again, sorry, in Wales, I propose something to the Senedd, which is being looked at, to allow for kinship care to be approved care and the benefit rules in Wales. But if they were to accept the fact that you could have grandparents looking after children without the same kind of regulations surrounding them that go to paid childcare, that could relieve an awful lot of pressure and actually give both kids and grandparents some pleasure as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good point, and Rosemary is right to raise it, because I think that also speaks to quite a lot of disconnect. The fact that grandparents have to work longer now, and of course the retirement age is slowly creeping up. So all of that is sort of, I don't know. It just feels a bit of a loose end, really, for me. Gareth, I mean, I know you've spoken about Wales as sort of being master of its own destination, and I know for the Scottish authorities that might be on, they would also talk the same about Scotland. But I mean, do you feel that some of these kind of decisions will most definitely need to be transferred to regional councils in England as opposed to local authorities?
I don't know what level of decision making that there ought to be, but yes, certainly the reality is that if you have a level of government, whatever it might be, that actually is focused around kind of making taking care of the family and looking at the future of children, and in Wales we have to take account of the Future Generations Act in every official decision that's made, then you end up with a very different kind of perspective on how you plan and what you do, I think. And it's that kind of effectively cultural and regulatory change that makes a difference. And we're certainly seeing that being delivered in Wales. We're seeing very clear differences between the way in which services are delivered and the type of services that are offered.
Okay, thanks very much, Gareth. I think on that point it's now 12:34, so we're slightly over time. So I'm going to thank you all for your contribution. We'll look at the jobs market report next week, because there's a connect. I mean, the three reports that we looked at last week, with housing, the poverty one this week, jobs market one that we'll look at next week. So we'll have a look at that next week. Can I thank you and Liz for coming on and your contribution? I thank Rosemary as well for her input, and Jeff as well. Don't forget, everyone, please raise your hand and join in the conversation. We do want to hear what's happening in your areas, and whether we're just talking out the tops of our hats, correct us if we're wrong. All these things are open for challenge. No shouting though. Yeah, so I will send out the slides like I did last week, and also there'll be the recording will go up onto our YouTube channel and onto our stage, so you should be able to get a copy of that, and I'll circulate the links as I did last week. And also I found out what I'll also circulate. I'll circulate the the poverty report as well to you, and I found a rather blast from the past, which I'll also share with all of you, which I'll send around. Okay, so I will thank you all. Hopefully we'll see you all next week. And on that basis, I shall say thank you very much and goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.